We're going to continue in the 8th book of Yisrayl, part 1. And we're going to be picking up in chapter 34. Okay? Judging and being able to condemn according to Yahweh's judgment. Judging and being able to condemn according to Yahweh's judgment. And for those of you who don't have your 8th book, the date on this is 6/28/08. 6/28/08. You know, this lesson is such an awesome lesson. That pastor, they're all awesome. But in particular, this one here, where pastor is encouraging us that when we go through the trials and the tests that we're experiencing right now, it's all part and parcel with the plan of Yahweh, okay? The whole scheme of Yahweh that's going to bring us into his image and into his likeness. These are the points that pastor goes over in this particular sermon. And you'll see he kind of he went this direction because he felt like he wanted to point certain things out to us at that time, 12 years ago, which are extremely pertinent to us today. Okay, they're extremely pertinent to us today because so many times we forget what Yahweh has brought us here for. And so we allow ourselves to become frustrated, angry, at the trials and at the tests. And we have to always be thankful to Father Yahweh. And allow ourselves to be mindful to Father Yahweh continually. Let me just send this. Okay, so now what pastor does in this sermon, he goes over the quartet. Okay, he goes into the quartet, and if you remember, the voice of the four living, okay, the four living, he showed that in the King James Version it says living creatures, but he showed that word living means active system, okay, an active government, okay. Those were or an active system. It means to be in operation, right? That's what that quartet was. So let's continue. Let's pick up here in verse 2. We're going to go over some of these points here. It says, of course, Yahweh said, you know, the pastor said, the peace of Yahweh be with each and every one of you, and you could be seated. Said, I'd like to take you back to the quartet this morning before we get into the sermon, because there are some misconceptions being put out as if they're coming from the House of Yahweh, and people are taking our word and copying it, but they're not sticking to it. You know, they don't understand, so they're getting twisted up, and of course, other people talk to them. And then they get mixed up too. Okay, they get mixed up with what they say and what other groups are saying. They get mixed up with what we say and tie it in with what other groups are saying. And again, that you'll find that occurs. And Pastor mentions in the sermon that if you're not studying, okay, if you're not feeding your mind with the teachings specifically that come forth from the house of Yahweh, you leave yourself susceptible to misunderstanding. Okay, and wind up confusing what the house of Yahweh is teaching with what you're hearing on the internet, what you might be hearing on YouTube, or what you might be hearing in Twitter. If the teachings of the house of Yahweh are not prominent in your mind, okay, if they're not the first thing in your mind, right, to be able to rightly divide between the clean and the unclean, you see, the only way that we know when prophecy is being fulfilled is if we've heard it from the house of Yahweh. there's a number. I mean, there's so many prophecies that have been fulfilled in these last days in the manner that they have been fulfilled, and nobody understands them except for the house of Yahweh. They look for a lot of the prophecies that are being fulfilled right now, and Pastor has shown this. They believe that a lot of them have already been fulfilled. Okay, which is desperately untrue, especially when it comes to the teachings of the two witnesses and the time period of the two witnesses. And that's what Pastor goes over here. He shows that in Revelation chapter 6, okay, so this is picking up on verse 3. He says, turn over to Revelation 6. We have here in verse 3, it says, Revelation 6 and 3, when he opened the second seal, I heard the second creature say, come and see. Verse 4, and there went out another horse that was red, and power was granted to him who sat upon it to take peace from the earth, and that they should kill one another, and there was given him a great sword. Okay, so we see this today, and that's what Pastor says in this lesson. He says if you watch the news, you can see it plainly. He says in verse 5, we see the third seal here. When he had opened the third seal, I heard the third creature say, come and see. And I looked, and behold, a black horse, and he who sat on it had a pair of scales in his hands. Now the next verse here shows you that this is in the time of the quartet. Verse 6, it says, I heard a voice in the midst of the four. In the midst of the four, it's called, or we translated it, living creatures. Okay? This is where Pastor shows what nobody else knows concerning the quartet. Okay? These little pieces that he just, he gives us, and we just have to listen carefully and apply it and put it together, gives you a great understanding that really that nobody else in the world has. Nobody else in the world has this level of understanding. Okay, it says here that we translated it living creature. It's actually just for living, which means for active governments. Okay, for active governments, for living governments. It gives you a time period. Okay, it actually gives you a time period. It's when these four governments are in action. Okay, and that's such an awesome understanding. He said specifically at this time period, but it's at the midst of the quartet when we see the cheap wheat and the cheap oil. And again, those prophecies concerning the oil and the barley, they identify a specific time period. And Pastor goes on to identify some of the prices, the prices, the changes in the prices. Like for instance, he says a dozen eggs at one point was $150 and now it's $193. He goes into talking about the beans was at one point it was $3.08. Now it's up to $5. In 2008, it was up to $5.06. He was talking about the lentils went up from $13.20 to $32. So this was the time period that he was identifying. That is also the time period of the quartet. Okay, where the price for food, and that wheat and that barley is identifying food. That food would be plenteous at one point. Okay, but then it would eventually start going in the other direction. Like right now, it's not food, but lumber is astronomical. It's astronomical how expensive lumber is at this particular time. Okay, but this identifies the fall of the system. Okay, the falling of the system. So let's pick up in verse 15 on the bottom of page 384 in the first column. It says, next week I'm going to break off from this. What we're doing this week and bring you some dates. Okay, so he's going to break off from what. Let me start again. He said, next week I'm going to break off from this. What we're doing this week, and bring you some dates. So he's going to bring some dates concerning what he just showed, and show you the things that are taking place with the Pope. And if you remember the hidden codes now, remember the hidden code. You see President Bush, Putin, Tony Blair, Prime Minister Tony Blair, Pope Benedict, and myself all together in one time period. So he's identifying which time period again. Just one single time period in the hidden codes. It couldn't be any other time period, brethren. Now, here, remember in Matthew 24 and verse 7, he showed the disease epidemics. If you watch the news, you'll see these disease epidemics. If you watch the news, you'll see the wars and the rumors of wars. If you watch the news, you'll see the building to the final conflict. Okay, because the nations are definitely angry at this particular time, and that grievous sore, which is one of 7 plagues to come upon mankind at this time, in this time period, has taken hold and has made people upset, angry, frustrated. Okay, all in this time period. It really is an amazing time period that we're in. So he says that the diseases have gotten worse. We're getting new ones almost every day. He says, I guess we're getting them every day. Not almost every day. Every day there's new afflictions. Okay? And it's just like what Pastor showed with the coronavirus. The coronavirus itself doesn't kill, but it occupies the immune system. Okay? It occupies the immune system and causes the body to have to react. So if there's a pre-existing condition, then now there has to be an allotment of energy taken away from that pre-existing condition to deal with the coronavirus, right? So it's really amazing all the things that we're seeing that come straight out of the scriptures, regardless of what anybody says. Oh, the scriptures have been tampered with and the Bible has been rewritten and written and rewritten. Okay, but we're seeing prophecy come to pass as it's written in the scriptures. So, and prophecy is for the believers. So those of us who are blessed enough to be in the house of Yahweh, to get this teaching that nobody else in the entire world understands. When they argue against the scriptures, they argue against Christianity. They're not arguing against the house of Yahweh. There's no way to argue against the house of Yahweh. The only way that they can argue against the house of Yahweh is if they lump the house of Yahweh in with Christianity. But if they know the doctrine of the house of Yahweh, they'll know that there is no what agreement does Christianity have with the house of Yahweh, or the house of Yahweh have with Christianity? None. And we do not walk together. Okay? 2 totally different organizations, 2 totally different systems. Okay, so it's just very interesting, and we should be very thankful that we're in the house of Yahweh and give thanks to Father Yahweh every single day. But it takes educating yourself to be able to do that. Okay, and you have to be able to educate yourself and do what Yahshua said also: watch and pray. Watch and pray. When you watch and you pray, you'll see what the condition of the world is. And you'll be thankful that you're not part of it. But if you got your blinders on, or the the flash of the silver and gold that coats the gods is alluring to you, you might not be able to know the difference. And to you, the House of Yahweh might just be another Christian organization, but you can only draw that conclusion if you're not studying, if you're not paying attention to the teachings, as Pastor says in this lesson. So he shows that diabetes is an issue where the insulin, either the body is not producing insulin or the body has, because it's type 1 and type 2, either the body is not producing the proper amount of insulin, or it's not able to utilize the insulin that's there. That's the difference between the type 1 and type 2 diabetes. Okay? But we'll continue. He says, let's pick up in verse 20. It says, this comes from the British Broadcasting Company. States, refusing grants for abstinence education. And in this, he goes in and shows that there was, I believe it was in Ohio, one of the political officials in Ohio didn't want the abstinence education to be given to the students because he said it was too harsh. Right? That it was too harsh of a teaching. Like, what's more harsh? Catching a STD or delayed gratification? Right? What's more harsh? Waiting on true commitment or having your heart broken over and over and over again, seeking for that one true love? The world is in such a horrible place. It's really incredible. And again, we should be thankful for being in the house of Yahweh. Let's go to verse 22. It says, and of course, this is work. Two jobs here, working side by side. Yahweh's work and Satan's work, going side by side. That's shown here. But Yahweh said, sin is going to abound in this time period, the same time period where the quartet is in place, the same time period where the two witnesses are performing their work, the same time period that the nuclear bombs have been created that can blot out the sun and destroy mankind from the face of the earth. That same time period is what we're talking about here. Well, of course, this is verse 23. President Bush, I was so glad when he introduced the abstinence program. And again, it was from, I said Ohio, but it was actually Iowa. It was Governor Chet Culver. Governor Chet Culver. And he said that, that abstinence program is just too harsh for the children. And Pastor had some choice words for him. Okay, because they showed plainly that the abstinence program, when it was being taught, that it was actually working with the children, cut down the inappropriate activities by 50%. The diseases were going down as long as people were being taught that, hey, you can wait. You can wait. You don't have to rush into things that will wind up being lifelong issues for you. Let's pick up on verse 32. It said, Pastor says, it's the only thing that will work. Okay, it's the only thing that has worked among all that's ever been put in the schools in 2,000 years. Verse 33, not only we are being attacked, the group south of here that has, and I believe that was the Branch Davidians, if I remember correctly. Okay, it says they had a little holiness, in their society, but of course, the president himself now, and as surely as surely he will see this. Surely he will see this, and possibly he will hear this sermon and know that we are behind him, behind his decision to teach that abstinence. And Satan did not like it. Satan did not like it, teaching abstinence. What do you mean you're going to take STDs? STDs is the way that I could get people's minds off of the way of Yahweh. Eating unclean food is the way that I could separate the people from Yahweh. What do you mean you're going to stop teaching, doing all of these things? Right? Let's pick up in verse 36. Well, we see now, if you remember last week, this is Hebrews 9 and verse 27, that is appointed upon man once to die. But after that, the sentencing, of course, the sentencing. Now, judgment has been given to mankind. That's what we saw last week. But mankind, the only mankind that's going to get this authority. Now we start getting into the wonderful blessings that Yahweh has to offer. Genesis 1:26 are those who Yahweh can make into his image and into his likeness. Now those will judge or rule as Yahweh rules. Will all be Yisrayl. Okay, we'll all be Yisrayl. Those who rule as Yahweh rules. Now, if you remember, all the work we've done coming down to this period right here on judging. Remember the sermon on Boaz and Rhea, David and Bathsheba, and Abraham and Sarah, and of course Moshe, Jethro, and Miriam, who was the leaders. Miriam, who was the leader of the women. Moshe writing the laws for them to get it to them so that they can, so that they can practice, so they can have these laws in front of them. Verse 38. This was under Jethro, who was a priest of Yahweh at Abelin in Israel. And of course, the just judge brought peace to Israel in the land that Yahweh had allotted for that time period right there. For the Savior to be born and die, and the temple to be built that Yahweh never lived in. Okay, Yahweh never lived in the temple, but it was built there. It was built for a purpose. And if you remember what Pastor taught us, the house of Yahweh was established in these last days. Okay, this was the establishment of the house of Yahweh in these last days. That temple was not the house of Yahweh. Okay, Yahweh was calling one from a country, two from a city, even among the children of Israel. Okay, but let's continue. It says, but they went ahead and built it anyway. Verse 39. So all of this work has come down to this right here, being able to judge. Yahweh judges and condemns. As Yahweh condemns, because that's going to be part of your job. It's going to be part of your job there of sentencing. It's appointed upon man once to die, but after that, this judgment or sentencing takes place. Okay, and we all were baptized, and the old man was gotten off of us in that watery grave. That's our first death. And even if we went through a second baptism, but it was all part of that first death. Okay, and Yahweh, we don't have to suffer the second death. Okay, let's pick up in 41, verse 41, where Pastor says, let's pick up in verse 40. It said, I would have liked to have skipped this whole sermon right here, but listen to what he says about this. The more I thought about it, the more I thought, if I leave this out, then nobody's going to understand the rest that follows later. And I said, I've got to waste this sermon, maybe 2 sermons on this, but it won't be a waste. He's got to use it. I can see it won't be a waste, but it's going to be boring, extremely boring. I could tell you right now, when he said that and going over this lesson, it would be boring to some. Okay, it would be boring to some. I didn't find myself bored at all. I didn't find myself bored. Let's go over to verse 46. And you've got to remember now, because Satan has gone to extremes, just like she's gone to extremes right now to try to stop the abstinence program of George Bush. She's going to extremes to try to stop it. She's going to extremes to try to stop the judgment of Yahweh, right? He went to show about how, he showed that some people will slip into the kingdom, but you as judges, okay, we as the family of priests, we can't be respecters of persons and allow our family members in because we like them or because we so-called love them. Ahab is not like that. It's not judging by the heart or judging by the eyes, but it's judging by Yahweh's judgments, and that's what he was showing here. It says, and there'll be more of these stupid jerks quit their jobs and try to shut the program down, But this rebellion is coming from higher up. It's coming from the 7 hills. Verse 47. But judgment denotes the process of investigation. You remember, judgment begins at the house of Yahweh. This is when our hearts are being investigated. Okay. Yahweh is investigating our hearts at this particular time. He goes in to show that investigation, the act of distinguishing and separating, is the Hebrew word 29:17. Okay, and it's the Hebrew word, he says, krima, right? And this is that judgment that he's speaking of. Let's go over to verse 52. But this word krima, it corresponds with the Hebrew word that we used over and over in the work leading up to this judgment right here. Here, it's talking about just judgments based on the laws of Yahweh. That's what krima is about. And that's the only way you can base your decisions, your righteousness. Your righteousnesses are as filthy rags to Yahweh. Why? Just because you don't have sense enough to examine totally the facts at this time. And this is talking about all of us who are overcoming, but specifically the world. You remember Pastor said previously that none of the world leaders are equipped to rule over their people because they haven't gone through the peaceful solution. But also for us here, these same people have not gone through the trials and the tests that would make them be able to be in that position. Okay? In that position to be able to rightly divide between the clean and the unclean. Pastor goes further. He goes into Romans 11, verse 33, talking about the depths of riches and the wisdom and the knowledge of Yahweh. And then he goes into the supplementation, right? Vitamin D. He talks about iodine and he talks about vitamin E. And that's, DIE. That's, if you don't have vitamin D, you don't have iodine, you don't have vitamin E, you will die. Okay? Just give you something to think about. Praise Yahweh. And at this time, I'd like to turn the class, if you'd all prepare yourselves, I'll turn the class over to the great Kahan, David Heimerman Hawkins.
Shabbat Shalom, everyone who is able to hear this broadcast. The sundown here at Abelin, the city of Yisrayl, was at 7:28 this evening, so it is another Holy Sabbath day has begun here at the House of Yahweh. I'd like to continue where the great Kahan left off. This is chapter 34 of the 8th book of Yisrayl, chapter 34, judging and being able to condemn according to Yahweh's judgments. In other words, bringing forth righteous judgment. And I'd like to read one verse from page 388 here to get started here in this part of the class. And that's verse 69 on page 388, where Pastor says, well, that's what Yahweh is doing, is choosing judges right now, choosing judges. He's chosen one so far. In all this 6,000 years, he's chosen one judge. He's got a bunch more. He says, because Yeshua was the firstborn of many brethren here. So Yeshua has qualified to be a judge in Yahweh's kingdom. He's our great high priest. He's our atonement. And I'd like to move on over to page 389 now in the 8th book of Israel, verse 81. And Pastor's reading Romans 11, verse 33, which says, "Oh, the depths of riches of both the wisdom and the knowledge of Yahweh." And you know, to me, that would be a great start for a judge in Yahweh's kingdom. One who is rich in both the wisdom and the knowledge of Yahweh. One of the characteristics of a great judge would be one wisdom, rich in the wisdom of and knowledge of Yahweh. Now here in verse 83, we read, but the complication that Yahweh, or the wisdom that he used to set you these laws for judgment, then if you break one of them, and he of course is referring to the Torah, Yahweh's perfect set of laws, the 613 laws of Yahweh. And Pastor says, oh, I figure this thing, I can figure this thing out. I know my mother, my uncle, they're going to do what's right. And I can see that already, it's in their eyes. I just feel it. I can just feel it in my heart. Now, those are not qualifications of a righteous judge. A righteous judge does not judge on feelings, on opinions, on respect for relatives, on respect for the rich, or the respect for, differentiating between the rich and those who are not. Those are not qualifications of a righteous judge. But Pastor says here, but if they don't choose according to Yahweh's judgments, the judgments that he has, he has gone to extremes. Yahweh has gone to extremes to set for you, to show you that these will work. He's talking about his laws. His laws will work. His plan will work. It's a perfect plan and based on perfect laws. And this is a complication that we see that it's talking about here. In verse 84, the knowledge of Yahweh, how unsearchable are his judgments, and his ways are past finding out. Very few will find out those ways, Pastor says, but we're going to be like Yahweh, and we'll see him as he is, and understand his perfect character and agree with his perfect character. We're going to be like Yahweh, and we'll see him as he is. That means we're going to understand what he is trying to show us. We're going to understand or have his understanding of this thing. In Romans 13, verse 2, therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of Yahweh. And a little explanation here of the ordinance of Yahweh. Resist all this ordinance that he went to extremes to make sure that it was absolutely perfect. Yahweh's laws are absolutely perfect. That's why breaking one or two or more of Yahweh's laws makes it less than perfect, because it interjects our own thinking into Yahweh's perfect set of laws, and that will never work, and it will not be allowed in Yahweh's kingdom. The same way with his judgments. If you resist them, he says, you resist the ordinance of Yahweh. And the scripture continues, and those who resist will receive damnation. Why? Because they're not in unity. They've committed sin by resisting the laws of Yahweh, by breaking the laws of Yahweh, and will receive damnation. That will be the reward. Now, are you strong enough to say you're condemned because you couldn't do this? Because you didn't do this? I know and he goes into, you're my mother, my brother, that type of thing. But his point is, we have to stand firm on the laws of Yahweh and judge righteously, just as our great high priest Yeshua gave us the example. Now in verse 88 here, 1 Corinthians 11:29, it says, "For he who eats and drinks unworthily eats and drinks damnation to himself, not discerning the body." Of course, this is talking about the Sabbath also, and service to mankind. Your service, speaking to those who are training to become judges and members of the House of Yahweh, your service to mankind and considering one another and being a blessing to one another, that's just part of this judgment of Yahweh here, the judgments of Yahweh. And then he goes back to Romans 2:2, "But we know assuredly that the judgment of Yahweh is according to his laws." The judgment of the Yahweh, we can depend on what that judgment is. If we learn the laws of Yahweh, there will be no surprises in our lives, because we'll know what Yahweh expects from us. That's the way that should have been translated. The judgment will be according to his laws. Again, and the scripture continues, "Against those who practice such things," you've got to remember what he's talking about. This word judgment, it's Yahweh's judgment, and it's word number 29:17. The judgment of Yahweh, it's shown, it's of Yahweh's laws. The word, it's krima. The way it's pronounced is krima or krima. I'm going to pronounce it krima. And it means, the definition of this word is a decision, the function, or the effect for or against a crime or a transgression. The judgment, the damnation, a condemnation, be condemned. Krima denotes the sentence pronounced a verdict and a condemnation. It is of a decision passed on the faults of another. A decision passed on the faults of another, of Yahweh's judgments upon men. And that's Romans 2:2 now, of Yahweh's judgment upon men through our high priest Yeshua. In Yochanan 9:39, and Yeshua said, for judgment I have come into the world. So he came to, it says, for judgment I have come into the world. Yes, that's what we're for. That's what Genesis 1:26 says. And just to, for those of you who are not familiar with Genesis 1:26, it's really a summary of Yahweh's plan for mankind. And from the book of Yahweh, Genesis 1:26, it reads, "Then Yahweh said, I will make man, or mankind, in my image, according to my likeness. They will have rulership over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." Talking about the microorganisms there and the small creatures. But that's Yahweh's plan, is to make mankind into his own image, which he did with Yeshua. He was trained by righteous parents, and he chose to be perfectly righteous. And he fulfilled every prophecy that Yahweh had inspired the prophets of old to write about our great high priest Yeshua, and he qualified to be the firstborn among many brothers. And Yeshua said, for judgment I have come into this world. Pastor continues here, the only just judgment that I can see, that I know of, has got to be based on Yahweh's laws. So that's one of the key points here on judgment, based on Yahweh's laws. And if you vary from those laws, you make weak the laws of Yahweh, and you resist the ordinance. And in doing so, as the Apostle Shaul was inspired to write, you pronounce damnation upon those in doing so. And the scripture continues here, and Yeshua said, for judgment I have come into this world, and those who do not see, might see, and that those who do see might not see, of the right of judgment. I'm going to go down here to verse 95 here. Pastor reads Psalm 8, verse 6. You made man to be ruler. So that's part of a judge is a ruler among the people. He is has a significant position in ruling and judging the people. You made man to be a ruler over the works of your hands. You will put all things under his feet. And that goes back also to Genesis 1:26, making man in Yahweh's very own image. And Yeshua said to that, and Yeshua says to that, and Yeshua said, for judgment I have come into the world, and of course all judgment, all authority is now put in the hands of the Son, yet not all things are put under him, but he has qualified for such things all this judgment. And Pastor goes down here in verses 96 and 97 to Revelation 20, verse 4, and this is talking about the very near future time period here in Revelation 20, verse 4. And I saw thrones, and they sat upon them, and judgment, there's that word judgment, was given unto them. And Pastor says that's the fulfilling of Genesis 1:26. That's the reason Yeshua said, for that's the reason I came into the world, that's the reason mankind was invented. In other words, was for judgment given to us. Verse 98, and we're going to rule with Yeshua, judging the world, rebuilding the world the right way, with based on righteous laws, judging all those who are left alive, some 2 billion people, plus all those who Yahweh called down through the centuries. They will be resurrected at that time, some to everlasting life and glory and honor, and some to shame and contempt. Going over to page 391, and verse 101 here, 1 Kepha 4, verse 17. This is a very important verse here in this time period. It says, for the time has come that judgment must begin at the house of Yahweh. When we come to the house of Yahweh, our judgment time does begin. Our time of testing and trying, and Yahweh is looking to our obedience in keeping the laws that were taught here, his laws as taught here at the great house of Yahweh. For the time has come that the judgment must begin at the house of Yahweh. At the house of Yahweh, notice that that's what it's for, judgment. And the reason I keep hammering on this is because I don't want you to think that you're not here to judge. You are. But if you use unjust judgments, you're going against Yahweh's laws. Now verse 102. Now that process is learning the laws, of course. And there's step one. You ask yourself, what can I do to qualify to be a judge in Yahweh's kingdom, to be a judge in Yahweh's house, the great house of Yahweh? Well, here's important step. Learning the laws, of course. You have, in order to judge, you have to know the laws of Yahweh to be a righteous and correct judge. That's what we saw in all of these sermons leading down to this, learning the laws. You can't just become a judge with an empty head. No, you have to have qualifications. Right now in the United States, the president is preparing to nominate a replacement for the recent Supreme Court judge that passed away. And so he very carefully looks for qualified people who have a reputation of knowing the law. They've learned it, they've practiced it, and their judgments have, at least the laws they judge by, they've been found to be reputable people. So, well, it's a similar process in Yahweh selecting judges. You can't just become a judge with an empty head. You've got to fill your head with Yahweh's laws and base your judgments on those laws. Our judgments must be based on the laws of Yahweh. And then you've got to start practicing these laws. So that's another point. So you learn the laws, you judge according to the laws, and you practice the laws yourself perfectly. Look at our great high priest Joshua. What did he do? He did these very three things here. He practiced the laws perfectly. So he was blameless he was blameless in his conduct. And then you've got to start practicing these laws. That's part of practicing righteousness. And then when you choose judges of those you resurrect from the dead, then you will choose them according to Yehezkiel 44 verse 23. So let's read 44, Yehezkiel 44 verse 23. Qualification of another, additional information on qualifying to be a judge. Yehezkiel 44 verse 23, and they will teach my people the difference between the holy and the profane, and show them how to distinguish between the unclean and the clean. So more qualifications for judges. It's all given to us by inspired prophecy. Ones who will judge by my judgments, they will keep my laws, my statutes, and my judgments, and they're the ones you will choose for that from those who are qualified. But they've got to be without sin. These judges have got to be without sin. That's what Yeshua said. He wasn't just bumping his gums or speaking frivolously or trying to figure out something smart to say when he said, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone." He's got to be without sin, totally without sin. So that means you've got to be practicing the laws yourself, ourself. Then you've got to be totally converted. Qualifications of a judge: being true and righteous, and practicing the laws himself, so he can give a righteous judgment to when that's called upon, required. Repent and be converted, or become converted, so that your sins may be wiped out. Then you will have authority to cast a stone or condemn to death or whatever. First, you've got to qualify for it. Yes, we do. And that's why we're tried and tested on these laws. That's why these little trials and tests come up, because Yahweh wants to see if we're going to make the correct choice. In verse 106 here, Yahaqob 8 verse 7, so when they continued asking him, Yeshua straightened himself up and said to them, "He who is without sin, let him cast the first stone at her." This is when the woman accused of adultery was brought before Yeshua for judgment. And they were actually, those who brought her were actually trying to trick him and find some reason to condemn him. Yeshua knew these people weren't keeping the laws. He knew, and they knew it, and they recognized what he was saying there, and they walked off because they knew none of them qualified to be a judge in the first place. They weren't qualified because they weren't keeping the laws they were accusing her of breaking. Now, remember the definition of word number 2917, krima. It means Yahweh's judgments. Yahweh's judgments. Now go back to Romans. Let's look at verse 2, verse 1 here. "Therefore, you are without defense, O man." And he's referring to some of the conduct that was going on at the time, which you can read in chapter 1 of Romans 2. "O man, whoever you are that judges, for in whatever you judge another, you condemn yourself. For you who judge practice the same things that they were accusing others of." Well, what does this mean then? The way it's written and the way you would see it here, it would contradict the other scriptures, but it really doesn't. And then Pastor goes into the word, he says the word here, it's a totally different word. This one is, instead of krima, it's krino, is the way it's pronounced. It means judgeth, it means to distinguish, to decide, to determine, and also means to esteem. And that can be used in a negative sense, the word to esteem, to decide, to determine. It also means esteem, and be, and we find it translated that way in several places. It means to conclude or ordain. It means to approve. And going down to Romans 2, verse 1, "Therefore you are without defense, O man, whoever you are that esteems or approves. For whatever you approve another, in these things you're approving." And I think Pastor's approaching this particular word in a negative sense, that, not judging strictly is what he's referring to here. In Romans 1, verse 32, "Who knowing the righteous judgment of Yahweh, that those who practice such things deserve death, not only continue to do these very things, but also approve." That is the same word, approve of those who practice them. Now keep that in the same thought. And then, so they approve of those who practice these things that Yahweh condemns. "Therefore, you are without defense," the scripture continues. "You who approve of these people doing these things that Yahweh has condemned." You see that? So Pastor's trying to point out the difference here in the judgment and in I'd like to go down to verse 116 here, where he says, you're going to be choosing judges. If we qualify to be judges, we'll be choosing, we'll be, working, choosing other judges. You're going to be above the judging. You're going to be sitting over the judges judging. You're going to be the supreme judges, just as this replacement that's now in progress regarding the Supreme Court of the United States of America. Well, Yahweh has higher judges also. You're going to be the supreme judges because you're going to be like Moshe, sitting judges out for this world. You won't be out there judging 10 or 15 or 20 people. You're going to be managing and judging that's going on among the thousands for 1,000 years, and there those who are going to be resurrected, and so forth. Over on in verse 118 on page 392, if you want to go there, if you're following along in the 8th book of Yisrayl, you know, of course, Pastor says here, I love my children, and what he's talking about is his seed, those who are taught, those who sit at his feet here in the house of Yahweh, and listen to his sermons and read his books and study his teachings. You know, he says, I love my children, and he's talking about us, we the members of the house of Yahweh. You know, of course, I love my children, and I wouldn't want to lose any of them, but I would readily turn from you, he says, and condemn you if you don't follow these laws of Yahweh, brethren. You know, it has to be that way. It has to be that way. We have to choose righteousness and be in unity with the overseer of the house of Yahweh, Yisrayl Hawkins, with our great high priest Joshua, and with Yahweh himself. Pastor says, I'm not going to choose against Yahweh. It means to hold, to consider, regard, esteem, to honor them. Well, when you honor them and they're holding on to sin, you're honoring sin. Favorably, to be favorable, to hold on to, regard, hold in high esteem. Well, that's what this word actually means. When you go beyond Yahweh's laws and you try to make up your own judgments based on physical contact or opinions or that type of thing. We must judge according to the written and the strict interpretation of Yahweh's 613 laws that we learn here at the Great House of Yahweh. I'd like to read verse 127 here. It says, the reason that you're going to have to make up your mind totally to accept what Yahweh, who has shown you beyond a doubt, is that he is the greatest wisdom in the universe. Let me start that over again. That's the reason you're going to have to make up your mind totally to accept what Yahweh, who has shown you beyond doubt that he is the greatest wisdom in the universe. He is. He is the only power in the universe. He is willing to share that power, that authority, with those who he can make in his image, but only those he can make in his likeness, and after his likeness, and after his image. So, we must come into unity with Yahweh and our great high priest Joshua, and we do so here at the great house of Yahweh as we sit at the feet of Yahweh's last witness, the great Kohan Yisrael Abel Hawkins.